Hello and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, I just want to remind our listeners to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. One of the many challenges facing governments and businesses during a crisis is ensuring the steady supply of food and other essential items. Unfortunately, our natural impulses to stock up in preparation for the possibility of shortages often kicks in at the same time that complex supply chains are coming under immense strain. Add to this the direct impacts of COVID-19 on workers in the food industry and the export restrictions on agricultural products that some governments have put into place to ensure that their own populations stay well fed, and you've potentially got the makings of a looming food security crisis. Fortunately, as my guest for today has documented, global food supply chains are adaptable during disasters, and they might just look very different as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. Joining me now is Robyn Metcalfe. She's a lecturer and research scholar at the University of Texas at Austin. Her most recent book is Food Routes: Growing Bananas in Iceland and Other Tales from the Logistics of Eating. Robyn, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for the invitation to speak with your audience. I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to talk about the food supply chain. It's a subject that's been near and dear to me for a long time, but I have found that people really don't want to hear about it, or they haven't wanted to hear about it, I should say, until this moment when almost everybody wants to talk about it. So this is an exciting time. It's this little, this big area in between producers and consumers, between the farm and the plate, is where there's a lot of action. And it really is the one thing that enables us to get enough food. We produce enough food, but often we can't distribute it in the right amount of quantities at the right time to the right people. So delighted to talk about the subject. Thank you.
Great. Well, hopefully this conversation will go a long way toward demystifying that topic and enlightening people about how exactly food gets from the source to their plates. So one thing that might be on a lot of people's minds is you have this situation all over the world where in countries that are being hit hard by the coronavirus, we see empty supermarket shelves on one hand, but on the other, you have government officials and food industry experts consistently reassuring consumers that there's plenty of food and other essential items available. So if that's the case, what's the difficulty in getting it to consumers?
Well, the thing about the food supply chain is it's built on optimization, really getting things to work in the best possible way. Sort of, operations management people have been all over this subject for a long time. So we're really pretty good at growing food, but we're not that good at distributing it. The optimizers that have been around since World War II have optimized for conditions that we're not seeing today. They've optimized for big centralized food distribution centers, for not having a lot of food close to urban centers so that it would tie up warehouse space. So what we're running into is a big shift of gears between what we really need now in terms of optimizing for this situation and how the supply chain has been designed in the past. So it's an exciting time, and that's what you're seeing now. You're seeing a lot of empty spaces because the food supply chain is having to adapt in new ways that hasn't been required of it in the past.
So essentially, suppliers have been stocking up on food to meet demand during regular conditions, and they just weren't prepared for demand under the current circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, they've been really optimized for example, conflict zones, food aid, or natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, where they're fairly isolated in a region and they're not, they don't occur over months and months and months. A situation happens, a logjam, a friction point somewhere, and the supply chain has been designed to work around that, adapt to that. What we're talking about right now is a global situation, so that it's affecting producers around the world. It's also affecting consumer behavior around the world. So it's happening everywhere at the same time. So the supply chain can't turn to another area and say, you step in now and provide this, or you step in now and provide that, or, because it's everywhere throughout the entire system. So it's like having a ripple effect happen everywhere at the same time. So that's really unique about this particular time that we're seeing.
So where are some of the major bottlenecks right now that we're seeing as a result of this coronavirus crisis in the food supply chain? Where are things getting held up?
Well, surprisingly, not in the places you'd expect. While we know that grocery stores have struggled to keep their shelves stocked and food delivered to people at their houses, those are getting ironed out, both with human beings filling the gaps and also with some sort of acceleration of technology. But the real bottlenecks are in the low-tech sectors, meaning truck drivers who can't find a loading dock, ports that are closed to ships. So, these are sort of real bricks and mortar physical restrictions in the supply chain that no matter how fast you get it loaded into the truck, you still could get still stuck in not so much traffic anymore, not so much of that, but you can't get into the warehouse to unload things. So I think it's fascinating. I think that we need to look at parts of the supply chain that are embedded in physicality, where we're really, how do we solve for that? How do we have enough docks? How do we have enough ports? So the movers of our food, I think, are really the area where, in a very sort of low-tech way, need help.
Are there any lessons that suppliers and producers learned from previous disasters that you mentioned, like Katrina, for instance, that are now being put into play and adapted to the current circumstances?
Well, one thing they've been good at, and they have been doing for quite some time, is building partnerships, sort of public-private partnerships. So, for example, Walmart or Cisco works with the Red Cross, and they do write very complex, very well thought out emergency plans for when there's pressure applied to the food supply chain. So what they've learned is that these public-private arrangements work really well. Here in Texas, we have a large grocery chain, H-E-B, and they have done an amazing job stepping in to do some of the things that Walmart did during Hurricane Katrina. So I think one of the lessons is that the private sector is more agile and more localized and has enough scale to get things done on the ground. They know their customers, they know the infrastructure. I think that will continue forward as well.
One of the things we've seen in recent years is the global distribution of food supply chains. And some experts are now arguing, on the basis of our experience with this pandemic, that should not be the case, that they should be less distributed. But you've actually argued the opposite, that in fact they should be more globally distributed. Why is that?
I think the what we're seeing across our entire sort of economy and culture and politics is a desire to bring things closer to customers, closer to consumers, to voters. That the scale that we've all been enjoying by having access to large amounts of food that have all been centralized, that era is sort of vulnerable to problems of this scale. So if you have all of your, I don't want to use that metaphor, eggs in one basket, but you know what I mean. In other words, if you have all of your food in one central location in these large, what they call large distribution centers all over the world, and we get one of these situations to occur, that happen, then you really are putting too many resources in one spot, that you really need to have redundancy and resilience by moving some of these distribution centers in more locations, closer to markets, closer to people, so that they can act as backups to each other, can respond more to unique situations and different reasons. So I see sort of a dispersion, sort of a micro network of warehouses that are able to respond quickly and shorten the distance, creating this sort of shorter last mile. And this is a new thing. I mean, it's been sort of like the 1950s and 60s computer networks, where everything wanted to be the large mainframe. They wanted to have these large concentrations of intelligence, whereas now, as laptops move to desktops, we're starting to see a lot of the power of distribution moved closer to consumers. I mean, you're seeing it come into neighborhoods, down to very localized situations. This, by the way, is not to mean that, I see this question come up, which is, this is the moment for us to all have local food. In other words, that we need to, now this will really push us into buy local. And I just worry a little bit about that conclusion, because if you mean by that we're going to rely in the future to solve problems such as we're seeing right now, if we're going to rely on small farms around a city, you're not going to be able to see the kind of scale that we need to feed large urban populations, but they aren't really equipped to be able to solve for some of the issues related to public health, contamination, food safety issues. They are usually undercapitalized and not able to really adapt to these government regulations for how we're going to protect the public from contamination in the food supply chain. So I think we need to sort of step back and think again about what is the role of these small farmers in this new equation that we're seeing. And it's not always that foregone conclusion that we're just going to, this is great, we're just going to grow food all around our cities in these small farms.
I wonder if there's a good example you can give us using one particular food item, for instance, to show how those kinds of flexible supply chains make the supply of food more adaptable.
Well, I can show you what's happening now that's not working, meaning that.
Sure.
We've had these, the way it has been working in the past is that we've had specialized supply chains. So, for example, we have supply chains that deal with cold chain, just perishables. We have dry goods. We have those things that go to food service, to hospitals, to schools, to grocery stores, to restaurants. And what's happened is that with the shifts of consumer behavior right now, and the government instruction to have certain sectors closed, those supply chains now are not able to operate as specialized as they have been before, so they can't enjoy the benefits of specialization. So what you're finding now, and we've been reading about this of course, is where, restaurants that have usually had suppliers just for them, when they're closed, they no longer need that supply chain, and yet the grocery store needs it. So there's been this great sort of mashup of restaurants who are appearing like grocery stores, and grocery stores that are appearing like restaurants, and all of these sort of ad hoc arrangements now, because everyone's having to cobble together newly specialized or much more adaptable and targeted supply chains outside of these beloved specialized supply chains that have operated for so long.
And how much of that change do you think is likely to be permanent beyond the current crisis that we're facing?
That's the question for almost everything about the current crisis, isn't it?
Fair enough.
It was who's going to want to go to work again? Who would want to go to school again? I think the stickiness of all of this is very, very hard to determine at this point. In the big picture, as a historian, I can look and say, this crisis has been 2 or 3 months. That's nothing, in terms of the larger arc of history. On the other hand, this has been a pretty emotional time for people, and I think in this hyper road test of our supply system, what we're seeing is the shakeout of the weaknesses. And I think that it's kind of a calling to order to make certain changes faster and consider what our priorities are. I think it's fascinating, for example, to see all of the conversations that were happening up to, let's say, the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, about plant-forward, plant-based food, cell-based meat, and about, sustainable, you name it, coffee plantations. And then suddenly, as if that world did not exist, we're now, running to the grocery store to get food. I mean, just basic comfort food. That will be really interesting to see if the conversation returns to some of those more social value conversations, those environmental issues, or whether or not it will cause a sort of re-examining of them to redefine what's truly sustainable. Can we run those sorts of programs under these conditions? So I think that will be sort of the truth-telling going forward, is to look at the supply chain and see how we integrate those conversations pre-COVID and with our experiences. I mean, it's very personal to people. So, this is where, people are in the survival mode. And, much like our experience with 9/11, but not exactly like it because it wasn't global at that point, how long will the tail be for making changes? And especially if we're going to consider those conversations that happened before the holidays. Are we going to go back to them? Are we going to pick pieces of it that are really sustainable in the big picture when it, as they say, really gets serious? So I don't know. No one does, really.
So one of the other ways that food supply chains have been optimized is through the use of technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. But what do our current circumstances say about the limits of that kind of technology?
Well, I think we've been hearing so much about all of the improvements that are being brought to us through the application of technologies, from robots to predictive analytics, some pretty fancy apps, food delivery. And I think with this sort of stress test that we're seeing now with our food supply chain, that some of those aren't as fully developed as we thought. And that's no criticism of the process. It's just that when you're under these sort of high pressure situations, you start to see what is really ready for showtime. And I think it will spur these developments and maybe prioritize what needs to happen first. And I think on another level, we're not seeing the robots rolling up to our doors and safely delivering our food to our doorsteps. We're seeing human beings do that. So the humans have stepped into the gap for now. We thought they were all going to go away, but they're there and they're surfacing in somewhat reassuring patterns. So I think the good news is that, us humans have a role to play here. And I think it will help us design sort of smartly human systems in the future. And that it's not a one-for-one replacement. That we need to be thoughtful about that. So it's sort of a peek at where we really are in terms of applying technology in this supply chain.
In the meantime, before we get to that point, food supply chains still require an invisible army of warehouse workers, logistics experts, and truck drivers, not to mention the farmers, ranchers, and fishers who harvest the food at its source. What can we do better to protect those workers, and by extension, our supply chains, from this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question because we've had these sort of invisible workers behind the scenes, processing food, shipping and driving it across the country. And now they're required more than ever, except that, for example, let's say in a meat processing facility, the factory model requires they work in tight groups, handling food and communicating and touching each other. And I think there'll be some changes made to improve their working conditions, but I'm afraid what's happening is this is just moving us faster and faster towards automation, so that you won't have humans in those highly sort of contaminated environments, that you'll have more machinery and the humans will move on to other jobs, hopefully, that don't subject them to unsafe working conditions. It's just been how business has been done up to this point, and it's served us well, except that in this environment, it's dangerous for both us and for the workers.
Something else we've seen recently that's a bit troubling is countries that are major agricultural exporters restricting shipments of food products like wheat and rice for other countries, and instead trying to ensure that their domestic populations have enough of it. What do you make of that phenomenon, and what kind of impact could that have if it sort of ripples out or has a broader impact on supply chains?
Well, these restrictions and blockades, or whatever you're talking about in terms of country not shipping rice, let's say, from Vietnam anymore to protect their own food supply. This is a normal reaction on countries, especially ones that are underdeveloped, having to assure that their populations are fed. But I think what it does is highlight this independence that we have had, sort of this overconfidence that this global supply chain will rely on specialization, and that we didn't need to have more redundancy than I think we will be needing going forward. So I think the impact is that people will rethink where they get their onions and where they get their garlic, because it may just be for a variety of reasons that they won't have access to it, especially in things like a global pandemic or a global crisis. So this is a big moment for globalization, I think. We can re-globalize with more redundancy, but the idea that we depend upon these big producers for especially some of these commodities, I think that's being called into question.
So in other words, the idea is to not have the supply chains be stretched so thin and just orchestrated so perfectly that one outage throws a wrench in the works.
Right. The supply chain designers have a lovely term for this called the bullwhip, which is basically you end up with a whip, you do a little flick with your wrist, but by the time it reaches the end of the whip, you've got this very large effect at the end of the bullwhip, which happens. You have one crisis in rice in Vietnam, and by the time it affects a multitude of things in the supply chain, and it's a much bigger effect than just not getting rice, for example.
So you spend a lot of time thinking not only about how our food supply chains are organized now, but how they'll look, let's say 10, 20, 50 years down the road. What's the most important and lasting change you see this virus having on the way we consumers in advanced economies purchase and eat food?
I just see this trend towards developing more redundancy, more backups, multiple supply chains for the same commodity, smaller, more agile, more distributed, and more automation. I mean, this is where this big sort of workforce shift that we're going to see coming down the road. And I'm not sure about this, that we'll all become our own, prepper, meaning we will think a little bit more about our own pantries and take a little more responsibility for being prepared. We've had a chance now to see what happens when we're not that way. So both at the local level, personal level, both at the governmental level, the national and the global level, I think there's multiple layers of preparation are going to now be required that weren't there before. I don't think it will affect, what kind of food we eat necessarily, but that's bound to have an effect as well.
Well, I know the first thing I'm going to do after this conversation is to take a long, hard look at what's in my pantry. So thank you very much, Robyn, for joining us and sharing all your insights. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Elliot. Really appreciate it.
Robyn Metcalfe is a lecturer and research scholar at the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in the history of food and food supply chains. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.